6 decades ago, $3.5 million disappeared from the impenetrable Banque Nationale de Paris, leaving investigators with nothing but empty vault compartments and a city's trust shattered forever. When Margot Dubois discovers a corroded safe deposit key wrapped in her grandmother's yellowed correspondence, the cryptic numbers etched into its surface unlock more than forgotten memories. The key doesn't just open doors, it exposes a labyrinth of wartime secrets where Nazi collaborators, resistance fighters, and banking dynasties converged in a conspiracy that reaches into France's most protected corridors of power. In the damp chill of March 1965, the polished steel door of the Banque Nationale de Paris's main vault swung inward, revealing nothing but ordered rows of empty compartments. $3.5 million had evaporated without a single triggered alarm or fractured lock, leaving behind only the metallic scent of absence and a city's trust shattered forever. The crime scene was pristine, a perfect vacuum of evidence that would consume investigators for decades. 60 years later, the scent of cedar and decaying paper filled the attic of a Montreux apartment as Margot Dubois pried open her late grandmother's trunk. Sunlight struggled through a single grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing over stacks of yellowed letters tied with faded silk ribbon. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate textures of antiques, brushed against something hard and cold, nestled deep within a bundle of correspondence from the 1960s. It was a corroded safe deposit key, its brass surface tarnished with a patina of green and black. A small, flimsy tag was attached to its head with a thin wire, bearing a sequence of numbers etched in faded ink. The key felt heavy in her palm, a solid piece of a past she never knew, a secret her grandmother had taken to her grave. Margot carried the key downstairs to her cluttered antique shop on the ground floor, its weight a persistent question in her pocket. She laid it on a velvet cloth atop a Louis Quator's desk, its cryptic engravings staring up at her. The numbers meant nothing to her, yet they felt like a password to a locked room inside her own family history. Later that week, a man in a rumpled but well-cut suit stepped through the chiming door of her shop. He introduced himself as Inspector Claude Moreau of the Financial Crimes Unit, his gaze sweeping over the organized chaos of her wares before landing on the key. He explained that routine inheritance filings had cross-referenced her grandmother's name with a dormant cold case file, a procedural flag that had lain silent for 60 years. Moreau's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes held the weary weight of a generational burden. He leaned closer to the desk, his breath catching for a fraction of a second as he examined the key. The numbers etched into its surface were not random, they were a ghost from his own past. He recognized them from the brittle, coffee-stained pages of his father's old case files, the ones that chronicled the legendary Banque Nationale heist. This was not just any key, it was a key from one of the stolen boxes, an artifact the police had believed was melted down decades ago. The air in the shop grew thick with unspoken history as Moreau gently picked up the artifact. The weight of his father's failure, a quiet shame that had shadowed his entire career, pressed against his chest with renewed force. He looked at Margot, whose family name was now inextricably linked to the crime that had destroyed his father's reputation. For the first time in 60 years, the case was no longer cold. It was here, warm and heavy in his hand. The key did not just represent a new lead, it was a reckoning waiting to be turned in a lock he had never expected to find. The silence of the past was about to be broken, and the sound would echo through the highest echelons of Paris. Margot watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She understood then that the cedar trunk in her attic had held more than just forgotten letters and her grandmother's keepsakes. It held the beginning of a story that someone for a very long time had desperately wanted to remain unfinished. Her inheritance was not one of porcelain dolls and lace, but of secrets and steel. The discovery was no longer a curiosity, it was a threat. Inspector Moreau requested access to the cedar trunk, his tone polite but underscored with an authority that left no room for refusal. Together, they ascended the narrow, creaking staircase back to the attic, the afternoon light now casting long shadows across the floorboards. He ran a gloved hand along the inside of the trunk, his fingers searching for inconsistencies in the wood. He found it near the bottom, a false panel, its seam almost invisible against the dark cedar. With a small pry tool from his investigation kit, he carefully worked it loose, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. The space was just large enough to hold a slim leather portfolio, its surface supple and unblemished by the passage of time. Inside the portfolio were not jewels or cash, but several sheets of brittle rolled-up paper. Moreau gently unfurled them under the weak attic light, his movements precise and reverent. They were the original architectural blueprints for the Banque Nationale de Paris, dated 1962. Penciled annotations marked the thick paper, detailing ventilation shafts, electrical conduits, and alarm system wiring. Precise timing sequences were scribbled in the margins, mapping out guard rotations and the seconds between security sweeps. It was a detailed step-by-step guide for bypassing the most sophisticated vault security of its era. Margot stared at the signature block in the bottom corner of the main schematic, her blood turning to ice. The elegant, familiar script read, "Henri Dubois, Chief Security Consultant." It was her grandfather's signature, an autograph she had seen on birthday cards and loan documents her entire life. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her grandfather, the man who had designed the bank's defenses, had also drafted the plan for its destruction. The inside job theory, the one Moreau's father had championed before being laughed off the case, was not just a theory, it was a documented fact, laid out in her grandfather's own hand. Moreau's pulse quickened, a grim satisfaction warring with the shock of the discovery. He finally understood the source of his father's obsession, the professional instinct that had seen a truth no one else was willing to consider. The lead investigator had been right, but he had accused the wrong man. He had looked at the guards and tellers, never imagining the architect himself was the culprit. Margot sank onto a nearby crate, the yellowed correspondence scattered at her feet. Her family story, the narrative of a diligent and respected security expert who had built a comfortable life through hard work, crumbled into dust. Their prosperity, their home, her own existence, it was all funded by the proceeds of the greatest unsolved heist in French banking history. Her hands trembled as she looked from the blueprints to the tarnished key. They were two parts of the same devastating puzzle, evidence of a betrayal that ran deeper than she could possibly imagine. Her grandfather was not the hero of her childhood memories. He was a master criminal. Moreau packed the blueprints back into the portfolio with meticulous care. He now held the how of the crime, but the why remained a gaping hole in the narrative. A man like Henri Dubois, a respected professional with a family and a reputation, did not orchestrate a $3.5 million heist without a powerful motivation. The key and the blueprints were just the first layers of an onion that had been sitting in the dark for 60 years, and he was determined to peel it back to its core, no matter how much it stung his eyes. Moreau's investigation moved from the dusty attic to the sterile environment of the National Archives. He spent days immersed in declassified intelligence files from the post-war era, his search guided by a new, unsettling question: where did $3.5 million come from in 1965? He cross-referenced the names of the bank's board members and major account holders from that year with records from the liberation of Paris in 1944. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then chillingly clear. The stolen funds were not the accumulated wealth of ordinary French citizens. The paper trail, thin but undeniable, pointed to a collection of accounts established shortly after the war, funded by assets whose origins were deliberately obscured. He found records of gold bullion transferred from Swiss banks and bearing refinery marks consistent with those used by the German Reichsbank. The money that vanished from the Banque Nationale was laundered Nazi gold. It was the plundered wealth of a defeated regime, secretly repatriated and held by French collaborators who had escaped justice after the war. The heist was not a simple theft from a bank. It was a raid on a hidden treasure chest of wartime secrets. Armed with this new context, Margot approached her grandmother's oldest friend, Madame Rousseau, who still lived in the apartment next door. The elderly woman, her memory, a fragile tapestry of vivid moments and gaping holes, sat with Margot in a living room filled with the ghosts of the past. Margot asked about her grandfather, Henri Dubois, and his activities during and after the war. Madame Rousseau's eyes, cloudy with age, darted nervously toward the window. She spoke of Henri's quiet intensity, his work with certain resistance cells that focused not on sabotage, but on tracking financial transactions. She recalled hushed, urgent conversations in the late 1940s, men and women visiting the Dubois apartment at all hours, their faces etched with a grief that never seemed to fade. The old woman lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, her hand gripping Margot's arm. She remembered hearing phrases repeated over and over through the thin apartment walls, settling accounts, hidden fortunes, and returning stolen wealth to its rightful owners. Henry, she explained, was not just a security consultant, he was a man obsessed with a justice the courts had failed to deliver. Moreau, listening to Margot's account of the conversation over the phone, felt the case shift beneath his feet once more. The moral landscape was becoming increasingly complex. His father had hunted a common thief, a man motivated by greed, but the portrait emerging of Henry Dubois was of something else entirely, a man engaged in a clandestine war long after the official peace treaty was signed. He began to understand that the vault had not been the target, it had been the instrument. Henri Dubois had not stolen from a bank, he had taken something from the people who used that bank to hide their sins. The crime was not about enrichment. It was about retribution. Margot ended the call with Moreau, the weight of her family's legacy transforming yet again. Her grandfather was no longer just a criminal. He was a vigilante, a ghost of the resistance fighting a battle 60 years in the past. The tarnished key in her possession felt less like evidence of a crime and more like the tool of a complicated, dangerous form of justice. The investigation was no longer about recovering stolen money, it was about excavating a buried chapter of French history, a chapter that powerful people had gone to great lengths to ensure would never be read. Moreau knew that unraveling this thread would lead him to the doorsteps of families who had built their modern fortunes on the forgotten crimes of the occupation. The archivist, a man with a deep reverence for history's paper trails, wheeled a cart of dusty ledgers into Moreau's cramped office. These were the original deposit records for the Banque Nationale de Paris from 1965, documents so old they were rarely requested. Moreau spent 2 days poring over the handwritten entries, his focus fixed on the specific safe deposit boxes that had been emptied. He cross-referenced the box holders' names with another list, one he had compiled from wartime collaboration records. The names matched, every single one of them. The shocking truth hit Moreau with the force of a revelation. The official victims of the 1965 heist were not innocent citizens. They were documented Nazi collaborators or their direct heirs, men who had profited from the German occupation of France. The money they had deposited, the laundered Nazi gold, was itself stolen property. It was wealth confiscated from Jewish families who had been deported, assets seized from businesses handed over to French sympathizers. The heist was not a theft at all. It was an audacious, brilliantly executed act of reclamation, a mission of post-war justice orchestrated by the very people the system had failed. One name on the list of account holders stood out, not just for its historical infamy but for its modern prominence: Beaumont. The account had been opened by Pierre Beaumont, a notorious industrialist who had made his fortune using forced labor during the war. His son, François Beaumont, was now a powerful and respected senator, a man who championed national pride while his family's empire was built on a foundation of treason and human suffering. The crime was completely recontextualized. Henri Dubois and his team were not thieves, they were moral vigilantes. They had not stolen $3.5 million. They had liberated it, taking back what had been plundered from their own communities. The case had transformed from a simple heist into a profound ethical dilemma. Margot absorbed the news in stunned silence, her perception of her grandfather snapping into sharp, heroic focus. He had not betrayed his post for personal gain. He had used his unique position as the bank's security architect to right an unforgivable wrong. The shame she had felt was replaced by a fierce, complicated pride. Moreau felt a deep, unsettling conflict. As a police officer, his duty was to the law, which defined the 1965 incident as a felony. But as a man, as the son of an investigator who had sought truth, he saw the undeniable justice in the act. The law had been broken, but a higher moral law had been served. He understood now why the case had been impossible to solve. The perpetrators had no obvious criminal connections because they were not criminals in the traditional sense. They were survivors, driven by a cause that transcended legality. They would have vanished back into their ordinary lives, their secret shared only by the silent bond of their shared history and purpose. The investigation was now aimed at a new target. It was no longer about finding the long-dead members of Henri Dubois's team. It was about exposing the living beneficiaries of the original crimes, the respected families like the Beaumonts who had successfully laundered their history as well as their gold. The rusty key was not just a tool to open a vault, it was a key to unlocking France's most protected secrets, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed legacies of its most influential dynasties. Margot and Moreau were no longer just solving a cold case. They were challenging the very narrative of post-war France, a narrative that had allowed collaborators to rebrand themselves as patriots and their stolen wealth to become respectable old money. The consequences of their pursuit were about to become dangerously real. Moreau's search for the vault team led him not to a grave, but to the sun-drenched coast of Marseille. A single name from Henri Dubois' known associates during the Resistance had flagged a match in the National Pension Registry. He found Simone Levy in a quiet nursing home overlooking the Mediterranean, a place where the past was meant to fade peacefully into the blue horizon. At 87, Simone's body was frail, but her eyes were as sharp as cut glass. Her arthritic hands, gnarled and trembling, rested on the arm of her wheelchair, but Moreau could still see the ghost of a younger woman's dexterity in her movements. When he mentioned Henri Dubois' name, her expression showed no surprise, only a quiet, weary recognition, as if she had been waiting for this conversation for 60 years. Margot sat beside Moreau, her presence serving as a bridge to the past. Simone had shared with her grandfather. At first, Simone was hesitant, her answers clipped and evasive, but when Margot showed her the tarnished key, the old woman's composure broke. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. She began to speak, her voice a low, steady current of memory. She described the team Henri had assembled, a watchmaker, an electrician, and herself, a locksmith whose family had been jewelers in the Marais district of Paris before the war. They were not hardened criminals. They were survivors, each of them having lost everything and everyone to the Holocaust. Simone's story centered on Henri. She revealed the why that had eluded investigators for 6 decades. Henri Dubois had not just been a member of the Resistance, he had lost his own parents in Auschwitz, their names on a transport list he discovered only after the liberation. His grief had hardened into a single-minded purpose to find and reclaim the stolen assets of deported Jewish families, assets that French banks were all too willing to hide for their new collaborationist clients. For years, Henri's network had tried legal channels, petitioning the government and the banks for restitution. They were met with bureaucratic walls, feigned ignorance, and outright refusals. The heist, Simone explained, was their final, desperate act of justice when every legitimate avenue had been exhausted. It was a declaration that if the state would not honor the dead, they would do it themselves. Margot listened in stunned, reverent silence. The grandfather she had been taught to admire for his quiet competence was now revealed as a man of immense courage and conviction. The family shame she had felt just days ago was entirely washed away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of his hidden heroism. His greatest crime was, in fact, his greatest act of love and remembrance. Simone described the night of the heist with the precision of a master locksmith, recalling her finest work. She spoke of the quiet hum of the vault, the silent tension, the shared resolve of a team bound by tragedy and purpose. They took only what was documented as stolen from their community, leaving the rest untouched, their mission one of reclamation, not greed. Afterward, they disappeared back into their lives, the recovered wealth distributed secretly to other survivors and to organizations dedicated to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. They never spoke of it again. They had sworn an oath of silence, sealed by their shared sacrifice. As they left the nursing home, the setting sun casting a golden glow on the water, Moreau felt the last pieces of the puzzle fall into place. He now had the how, the why, and a living witness. The case was, for all intents and purposes, solved. But as he looked at the file on his passenger seat, he knew the most dangerous part of the investigation was just beginning. Exposing this truth would mean confronting a legacy of collaboration that was not just historical but alive and well and deeply protected. The revelation from Simone Levy spurred Moreau to re-examine his own history, to look again at his father's dusty case files, not as a record of failure, but as a map. He requested access to the sealed police archives, specifically the supplemental and confidential reports related to the 1965 Banque Nationale investigation. What he found sent a tremor through his entire understanding of his father's life and the institution he served. Buried deep within a box marked for permanent storage was a secondary file, one his father had created off the record. It contained detailed notes, surveillance photographs, and transcripts of unofficial interviews. The evidence was undeniable. Inspector Jean-Luc Moreau had solved the case in 1966. He had identified Henri Dubois as the mastermind. He had pieced together the motive of reclamation and even had a list of the likely team members, including Simone Levy. His father had not been incompetent. He had been brilliant. He had uncovered the entire conspiracy, from the Nazi gold to the collaborator accounts. But the final pages of the file revealed the devastating truth. A formal report had been submitted, and a week later it had vanished. In its place was a direct handwritten order from the highest levels of the Ministry of the Interior, commanding him to cease all investigation into the victims of the heist. The official narrative was to remain a simple, unsolved robbery. The cover-up extended to the very top of the French government. The collaborator families, including the Beaumonts, had already spent 2 decades re-establishing themselves as pillars of post-war society. They were embedded in politics, industry, and culture. Exposing them as beneficiaries of Nazi war crimes would have destabilized the fragile national unity France was trying to project. The government chose silence over justice. Moreau's hands shook as he read the last entry in his father's hidden notebook. It was a personal memo, not meant for any official record. It documented a private meeting where he was told, in no uncertain terms, that his career would be over and his family's safety could not be guaranteed if he pursued the matter further. He had been given a choice: bury the truth or bury his family. The revelation shattered Moreau's lifelong perception of his father. The quiet, withdrawn man he remembered, the one who retreated into shame and drank too much after being pulled from the case, was not a failure. He was a man who had been silenced, a good detective crushed by a corrupt system he could not fight. The weight Moreau had carried his entire life, the need to redeem his father's name, was suddenly lifted, replaced by a cold, searing anger. He finally understood his father's bitterness, his warnings to Claude to trust the evidence, but never the institution. It had not been cynicism. It had been a desperate coded message from a man trapped by a terrible choice. His father had not failed the case. The case, and the country he served, had failed him. Margot saw the change in Moreau when he returned to her shop that evening. The weary burden in his eyes was gone, replaced by a steely, unyielding resolve. He explained what he had found, the story of a father's sacrifice and a government's complicity. The rusty key on the velvet cloth no longer symbolized just her grandfather's secret. It now represented 2 generations of silenced truth. Henri Dubois had been silenced by the failure of the courts. Jean-Luc Moreau had been silenced by the corruption of the state. The conspiracy was no longer a historical event. It was an active, ongoing deception that had shaped their lives in ways they were only just beginning to comprehend. Moreau knew he could not let the story end as his father's had. He would not be silenced. This was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about honoring his father's impossible choice and finishing the work he had been forced to abandon. The risks were greater than ever, but now the fight was personal. The moment Moreau reactivated his father's inquiry by officially requesting the Beaumont files, the system pushed back. Senator François Beaumont, a man whose public image was built on decades of carefully managed respectability, mobilized his network with ruthless efficiency. The invisible walls of power that had crushed Jean-Luc Moreau 60 years ago began to close in on his son. Moreau's superiors called him into a tense, closed-door meeting. They spoke of budget cuts, departmental restructuring, and the political sensitivity of investigating a sitting senator. The threats were veiled in bureaucratic language, but the message was clear: drop the case or his career would be dismantled piece by piece. Simultaneously, Margot's life was thrown into chaos. Her antique shop, which had operated smoothly for years, was suddenly subjected to a series of aggressive, unannounced inspections. She received notices of obscure permit violations and a full-scale tax audit timed to drain her resources and intimidate her into silence. The attacks were surgical, designed to destabilize her business and send a clear signal that her family's past was a dangerous territory to explore. Instead of retreating, the pressure forged a stronger alliance between them. They were no longer just an investigator and a civilian. They were partners in a fight against a powerful, entrenched enemy. Their goal crystallized around a single objective: finding the final safe deposit box, the one the tarnished key belonged to. According to Simone Levy, that box contained not money, but the one thing Henri Dubois valued more: the proof. The box was located in a defunct branch of the Banque Nationale in the 2nd arrondissement. The building was no longer a bank. It had been converted into a highly exclusive private club, a discreet playground for France's political and financial elite. Senator Beaumont himself was a prominent member. Infiltrating the club would be their own modern heist. Their methodical preparation mirrored the planning documented in Henri Dubois' blueprints. Margot's deep knowledge of her grandfather's work became their greatest asset. She understood his security philosophy, his preference for psychological deterrence over brute force, his tendency to build in subtle, undetectable bypasses known only to him. She studied the building's updated schematics, which Moreau obtained through an old contact. She recognized traces of her grandfather's design DNA in the vault's underlying structure, even with modern upgrades. She theorized that the original emergency access protocols, designed by Henri, might still be dormant within the system, hidden beneath layers of new technology. Moreau handled the logistics. He mapped out the club's security schedules, the staff's routines, and the windows of opportunity. He secured false identification and devised a plan for them to enter as maintenance contractors during a large private event hosted by the club. The tension mounted with each passing day as they rehearsed their plan, every detail critical to their success. The night of the infiltration was cold and clear. Dressed in nondescript overalls, they slipped through a service entrance, their hearts pounding in unison with the faint thumping of music from the party upstairs. They moved through the silent, sterile corridors of the building's basement, every shadow a potential threat, every distant sound a reason to freeze. They were not just trying to open a box, they were walking into the heart of the enemy's territory, armed with little more than a 60-year-old key and the ghost of a brilliant security consultant. The weight of both their father's legacies rested on this single, desperate gamble. They had to succeed, not just to find the truth, but to prove that power and time could not bury it forever. The air in the basement of the private club was cold and still, a stark contrast to the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and laughter filtering down from the floors above. Moreau kept watch while Margot knelt before the control panel of the old vault door, her fingers tracing the wiring. Using a small electronic device, she sent a low-voltage pulse into a specific circuit, a technique she'd read about in her grandfather's private journals. There was a soft click, and a small green service light, long dormant, flickered to life. Her grandfather had built a back door, and it was still open. She inserted the corroded key into the lock of safe deposit box number 347. For a moment it resisted, the metal grinding after 60 years of disuse. Then, with a final decisive turn, the lock gave way, the sound echoing loudly in the silent vault. Margot pulled the long metal box out, its weight heavier than she expected. They carried it to a secluded corner of the basement, prying it open with a crowbar. Inside there was no gold, no cash, no jewels. The box was filled with documents, meticulously preserved in waterproof oilcloth packets. Henri Dubois' treasure was not wealth, it was evidence. The first packet contained a stack of black and white photographs. They showed high-ranking Nazi officers meeting with prominent French industrialists, Pierre Beaumont. Among them, their smiles starkly incriminating. Another photo showed a German convoy leaving a Parisian factory owned by Beaumont's family, loaded with materials for the war effort. The next packet held the core of the proof, detailed financial records. These were not copies, but original ledger pages, meticulously cross-referenced with Swiss bank transfer slips. They documented the systematic seizure of Jewish assets, homes, businesses, art collections, and traced their liquidation and conversion into the very gold that had been deposited at the Banque Nationale. A third packet contained personal letters, written in a variety of hands. They were correspondence between Holocaust survivors in the years following the war, a heartbreaking and determined network sharing information, tracking their stolen heritage and coordinating the effort to reclaim it. Henri Dubois' name appeared throughout, not as a leader issuing commands, but as a central point of contact, a man trusted to carry the weight of their collective mission. But the final document was the most explosive. It was a list, handwritten by Henri himself, titled Les Bénéficiaires, the beneficiaries. It detailed not only the original collaborators, but also their children and grandchildren who continued to control the inherited, laundered wealth. It named dozens of the most respected figures in modern France, politicians, media moguls, judges, and corporate titans. Senator Beaumont's name was at the top. The vault did not contain $3.5 million. It contained something far more valuable and far more dangerous, the unassailable truth. It was a detailed accounting of France's hidden sins, a comprehensive indictment of a segment of the nation's elite. Henri Dubois had not just planned a heist, he had curated a historical time bomb. Moreau and Margot looked at each other, the enormity of their discovery settling upon them. They now held the power to dismantle entire dynasties, to force a national reckoning that had been suppressed for more than half a century. The documents in this box could topple a generation of French aristocracy built on a foundation of lies. They had found the end of the trail, but it was also the beginning of a new, more perilous conflict. They had the proof. The question now was what they would do with it, and whether they could survive the consequences of bringing it into the light. The ghosts of the past were no longer whispering, they were screaming for justice, and this box was their voice. The Beaumont family estate sat nestled in the countryside outside Paris, a sprawling mansion of stone and slate that radiated old-world power. Security was subtle but absolute. Moreau and Margot were granted entry only after he invoked his official capacity as an investigator and referenced a matter of urgent national security tied directly to the senator's family history. They met Senator François Beaumont in his private library, a room paneled with dark wood and lined with leather-bound books that smelled of money and influence. He was the picture of composure, a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. He offered them coffee, his demeanor one of mild curiosity, as if entertaining a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. Moreau dispensed with pleasantries. He laid a single photograph on the polished mahogany desk between them, Pierre Beaumont, the senator's father, shaking hands with a uniformed SS officer in 1943. The senator's practiced smile did not falter, but a flicker of something cold and hard entered his eyes. He dismissed it as wartime propaganda, a common smear. Margot then placed one of the ledger pages next to the photo, the page detailing the transfer of assets from a seized Jewish textile company into a Beaumont-controlled account. Her voice was steady as she spoke her grandfather's name, Henri Dubois. She explained that he and his team had reclaimed what was stolen and that they had kept the receipts. One by one, they presented the evidence from the safe deposit box. The photographs, the financial records, the list of beneficiaries. With each document, a layer of Senator Beaumont's composure was stripped away. The mask of political grace crumbled, revealing the raw desperation of a man watching his entire world and his family's legacy stand on the verge of collapse. Finally, backed into a corner, his face pale and beaded with sweat, Beaumont cracked. He admitted to knowing about his family's history, dismissing it as the complicated reality of survival during the occupation. But then, in a desperate attempt to regain control, he revealed the deeper, more terrifying truth. "This is bigger than my family," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "My father was not the only one. There are others, dozens of us, the children and grandchildren of men who made difficult choices. We are a network. We have protected each other for generations, ensuring this history remained where it belongs in the past." He confirmed the existence of a shadow network of powerful families, a silent pact of inherited guilt that influenced French policy, justice, and media. This was the group that had silenced Moreau's father. This was the force that was trying to crush them now. Then came the final, shocking offer. Beaumont stood, walked to a hidden safe behind a bookshelf, and retrieved a thin, worn file. He placed it on the desk. "Everything you want to know about your father's case is in here," he said to Moreau, his eyes gleaming with a strategist's cunning. "The original reports, the direct orders, the names of the officials who threatened him. I will give you his complete vindication. All I ask in return is your silence. Let the past die." It was an impossible choice. Moreau could have the personal justice he never knew he sought, the proof to clear his father's name, to give him the honor he was denied in life. Or he could pursue the larger, more painful public justice that his father, Henri Dubois, and countless others had been denied. Margot watched, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw in that moment the full scope of her grandfather's mission. He had achieved a form of justice for his community, but it had been incomplete. One generation's heroism, she realized, often required another generation's courage to see it through to the end. The reckoning had arrived, but its final outcome rested on the decision Moreau would make in the next few seconds. Inspector Claude Moreau looked at the file on the desk, the tangible proof of his father's honor, and then at the desperate, calculating face of Senator Beaumont. For a moment the library was utterly silent, thick with the weight of 60 years of secrets. Moreau slid his father's file back across the polished mahogany. "The past doesn't die," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "It just waits." The next morning, unmarked packages arrived at the offices of Le Monde, Agence France-Presse, and several international news outlets. Each contained carefully curated copies of the documents from Henri Dubois' safe deposit box, the photos, the ledgers, and the list of beneficiaries. There was no note, no sender, just the cold, undeniable evidence of a nation's hidden history. The story exploded. It dominated headlines across France and the world, a scandal that cut through the heart of the French establishment. Senator Beaumont's career ended overnight with a terse resignation. Dozens of other prominent families, their names dragged from the shadows of the past into the harsh light of the present, faced a firestorm of public outrage and legal inquiries. The story sparked a painful but necessary national reckoning with the lingering specter of wartime collaboration. Moreau, having anonymously released the information, formally closed his father's case, citing new evidence resolving the 1965 incident. In his final report, he made no mention of the cover-up or the government officials involved, choosing instead to let the unveiled truth do its own work. He had made peace with his father's forced silence, understanding now that it was not an act of weakness, but a painful sacrifice made to protect his family. By choosing a different path, Moreau honored that sacrifice more deeply than any official vindication ever could. The final twist was not one of conspiracy but of transformation. The narrative of the great unsolved heist was rewritten forever. Henri Dubois and his team were no longer remembered as audacious criminals but as righteous vigilantes, figures of a forgotten resistance. Margot Dubois found her own way to restore a legacy. She began transforming her antique shop. The Louis Quatorze furniture was moved aside to make room for display cases. In them she placed her grandfather's tools, his blueprints, his lock-picking instruments, alongside recovered photographs of the families whose wealth he had fought to reclaim. The shop became less a place of commerce and more a memorial, a small, quiet museum dedicated to an unofficial chapter of Holocaust survivor resistance. One afternoon, months later, Moreau visited her. The shop was filled with visitors, reading the stories displayed on the walls. In the center of the main room, on a simple pedestal under a single soft light, sat the corroded safe deposit key. It had been cleaned, its brass surface polished to a warm glow, the engraved numbers sharp and clear. It had opened a box, and then a case, and then a nation's buried conscience. Its true purpose was never to unlock a vault filled with gold, but to unleash a truth far more valuable. In the end, $3.5 million had not simply vanished into the night. It had purchased 60 years of delayed justice, a price that was, at long last, finally paid in full.